Today, we'll be talking about creating an analytic file. My name is Sammy Seikow. I am a technical analyst at ResDAC. I have not worked on the files as long as the rest of the team has, but being so new and having stumbled a lot, I think I can offer you at least the mistakes I've made along the way. So during this segment, we will have time for questions at the end. I will try to check chat every once in a while, but we'll try to get to all the questions as we see them, or we'll address them at the end of the session. So our agenda for today is we're going to do a general overview of the analytic files. So the benefits of an analytic file, designing and creating an analytic file. Then we'll go over some troubleshooting tips with some examples and then review everything we talked about. So what are the benefits of analytic files? Analytic files are made by us for us. So essentially, you can really think about them as cleaned and processed data files that allow us to complete our goals. Steph and Nate and Beth had mentioned this previously, but CMS data can't always be used right out of the box. Normally, we need to go ahead and do some type of manipulation or editing so that the data allow us to do what we need it to do. Analytic files aren't a one-size-fits-all thing. The look and the feel of an analytic file will depend on a project's needs and honestly the analyst as well. So analytic files can be anything from like an all-encompassing file with very little removed, bare bones, just what's needed, the minimal variables, the minimal people. Or some of you might like to have multiple related files that can merge to each other, but you don't want to have one large file. You want to have that flexibility of merging smaller files together as needed. So why do we use analytic files? Most of the time, well, almost all the time, they should make your job easier. They're just a file that's ready to use. So if you sort of have a large project, you might think about let's make one analytic file that can do A, B, C, D. It'll help you save time on coding and processing. If you guys haven't worked with the large files, with large claims files before, processing and coding can take quite a bit of time. So when you have a prepared analytic file, you don't have to run all that code again that you used to create the file. You can just access the file itself. It removes noise when reviewing output. So what that really means is noise in this case is cleaning and fine-tuning the data. So you don't have to worry that about are the assumptions I'm making right now about the data correct? The noise, you should have removed that a little bit so that you're like, okay, yeah, I don't have to worry about duplicates, or I don't have to worry about chart reviews and things like that. Also, they can prevent the overwriting of the original data. That is the worst case scenario, in my opinion. So you definitely don't want to overwrite the original data. So the analytic file is just, like a copy, a clean copy of the original data. Creating analytic files isn't always easy, but the payoff down the road really should be worth the effort. So designing analytic files, and you'll notice that I use both words designing and creating. I want to sort of separate those terms. So designing in this case is really more planning, and creating is really more looking at how you go about coding. So we're going to go and talk about designing or planning analytic files right now. So before we get started, this is just one of many, many different ways you can think about approaching your analytic file. So just take what works for you and ignore what doesn't. It's really just the starting point to get you thinking about, okay, when I start with the data, how do I get what I need? And the method we're talking about today is going to be how to create an analytic file by working backwards. So essentially you start with your end product, what you want, and then you keep moving backwards to identify creation steps. This is a really great method if you want to keep the big picture at the forefront. The only thing is that it sort of requires working knowledge of data file structure. I typically do this method because I am the type of person that when I go to Target, I buy everything except what I need, and then I have to go back and buy what I need. So think of it as going to the store, and getting what you need first, and trying not to get distracted by all the little things on the way. So the design phase, step one, I think about what is the final product, design what it looks like. Step two is designing the analytic file. So what table do I need to create my final product? And then step three is planning a roadmap. So that essentially means, what do I need to create my analytic file? And then the creation phase, like I said previously, is pretty much the coding aspect of it. So you use your data roadmap to sort of guide you there. And then you review the analytic file and you troubleshoot troubleshoot issues as necessary. So designing the final product. Before I dive too deep, I do want to just sort of say, like, the final product is very much dependent on these other three blocks that I've shown here as well. So your study design, your cohort, and your data sources. But we're sort of skipping to the final product because we're just looking at that for this segment today. So what can a final product be? A final product can be anything, right? And so I put some examples here: a summary table, a regression model, tool, machine learning, dashboard, etc. What you really want to think about for the final product is, what do I need from the data in order to create, if you're doing a report or making a dashboard for a website, things like that. So it's more on the data side of things than like if you're doing a written report or something. So this is our scenario for today. It's a really simplified scenario. Don't think too deeply on it. We're doing a very high level, very simplified for the process. So our study design for today is we're interested in learning if ER wait times impact patient outcomes. So our cohort will be Medicare beneficiaries who utilize hospitals in our external data set. So this is going to be a fictional data set that was randomly generated. And then our data sources that we will have are Medicare claims data, and then our fake external data set, the hospital ER wait times. And then our final product will be our regression model. Just doing a little disclaimer on this. Normally when you plan on this, it doesn't come that quick, I'm sure as many of you know. So don't think this is going to be like a one-day thing. This will take a lot of thought to it. So our final product, like I said, is a regression model, and I've sort of written it out here in two ways. We have the top in bold, which is just the equation itself. So the outcome, negative patient outcomes as a 1, 0. And then we have the inputs, which are the average ER wait time, which will be a continuous variable, age, continuous variable, and gender listed as female, 1, 0. Again, you don't have to be this detailed. I have to be this detailed because if I'm not, I will forget it later. So you're really looking into me right now. So don't mind it if you're like, oh, wow, she writes everything down. Yes, I absolutely have to. If you don't have to, totally don't feel like you need to. And then the table below is just another way of looking at the model. So predictors and outcomes. So what does my analytic file look like? So what table will lead to our final product, or in this case, our regression model? So things we want to think about is, what do our rows represent? Our unit of measurement. Will it be claims? Will it be beneficiaries? Will it be hospitals? Things like that. And then what columns do I need? So what variables do you need from the data in order to actually fill your final product? So we'll see, I copied the regression model here, and then there's a little arrow down and then pointing at a table, and the table sort of outlines all of the different items that I've decided I want to keep. So I'm keeping a claim ID and a Benny ID. That's mostly so that I can link back to the claims files if I need to. I have a negative outcome variable, a provider ID, average ER wait time, and then age, and then gender. So I think we'll run a little poll now. So what unit of analysis will you use in your studies using CMS data? And then we have some examples here. All right, so it looks like most of you are thinking, like it's going to be beneficiary level, and then it's pretty even across providers, inpatient stays, procedures, and undecided, and totally okay to be undecided. Sometimes you really don't know until you dig into the data. All right. All right, so the next things we want to think about are what data elements do I need for my analytic file? So again, this is just another step back. From here on, these are some suggestions I think are helpful to think about. So definitely use ResDAC or CCW data dictionaries as a resource. Even if it's just opening the data dictionary and highlighting or noting everything that sounds like it might be useful, totally legitimate. I do it all the time. You'll also want to identify files and file segments, and file segments are really more important for when you're coding down the road. So some commonly used segments are the claim files and then the revenue center or line file. And then I've got other segments listed as well, condition, occurrence, span. Those aren't used as frequently, but do have useful information depending on your needs. And then also identify the variables of interest, which leads back to the file segments. Sometimes I've done this before where I think that there's a variable in the header and it's actually, in the revenue center or line file. So when I run my proc SQL, nothing runs, and there's nothing more painful than waiting, a few hours and then finding an error message at the end of it. So that's why I definitely recommend sort of taking note of which file segments variables are included in. So what happens when you have to choose between two data sources with the same information? So I know we've gone over this already, the MedPAR versus inpatient claims files, so I'll sort of skim over this a little quickly. But what happens if you have to choose between two data files with similar information? And ultimately you're asking which option is best suited for my study or my needs? And this is where you really have to think about your final goals and think about how much precision you need to reach your final goals. And precision can be measured in a lot of different ways. It's really what's most important to you and your team. But one thing you can think about are file contents. So for the variables, how complete are the variables, especially the ones that you need? What are the variable definitions? Sometimes the definition is different than what you assume it would mean. Definitely speaking from experience on that one. And how are the variables derived, right? So if you're working with the MedPAR where each row is a stay, you just want to double check and make sure that the derivations used to create the MedPAR fit what you need for your study as well. And then, of course, there are external factors as well. So whatever your budget or time, effort, cost, access, all of these things sort of speak to it as well. So our scenario for today, this is the table that I showed previously. So what I've done is I sort of circled the table columns and what I think the files of interest, how I can populate those columns. So the first four, I'm like, okay, inpatient, outpatient. I'm going to, because I'm looking at ED, I'm doing inpatient and outpatient definitely, but I'm also going to use those files to define patient outcomes. The ER average wait time, that's going to come from my external data set. And then our demographics are going to come from our MBSF base. So just summarizing our scenario, so we went ahead and requested the following CMS data, CMS in quotation marks, because this is really like fake CMS data. I just randomly generated it in Excel. So these are not real people or real data, and they may or may not make sense. So we went ahead and we got 1 year of the inpatient and outpatient fee-for-service claims for our hospitals of interest. And then we have 1 year of MBSF base for the beneficiaries treated at our hospitals of interest. And then we have the linkable external data set that I mentioned previously. And we are just going to assume for the sake of being able to focus on the actual creation of our analytic file that the data are already cleaned. This is not true for CMS data, so don't assume it's clean when you get it. Definitely do some cleaning on your end, but for the scenario today, the data are very clean and perfect. So I'm going to show a slightly confusing slide. So I just wanted to prep you guys ahead of time. What you'll be seeing is sort of similar to what you'll see here. It's going to be going backwards because that's the methodology we're talking about today. So on the left-hand side, you'll see the final product, and then you'll see the analytic file, and then you'll see the data. All right, so this is sort of the bulk of what we're going to be thinking about today. So we're starting with our analytic file, and then I added the table as well. I'm typically thinking about both when I'm planning an analytic file. So the first things I note is when I go backwards, what can I get directly from a file without needing to make any edits at all? And that's what these darker squares represent. The external file, I don't need to make any edits to it. I can just pull the average ER wait time right out of it. And then same with the MBSF base, I can pull age and gender right out of there. However, I know that there's going to be some type of ER events file that I'll have to create because I know it's going to come from both the outpatient and the inpatient. So again, break it down more. I know that there's going to be outpatient ER events and inpatient ER events. And then how can I break this down further? Or do I need to break this down further, right? And in this case, we do need to break it out further. So we're going to have an OP Revenue Center rollup file, and I'll sort of explain what that means in a little bit, and then a claim file. So both for outpatient and for inpatient. And then we finally get to our last, we finally get to like what I consider like the raw file. So exactly what you get from CMS. You'll notice here that it says for the outpatient claims file, I'll circle it. Oop. So here you might be like, Sammy, these two are exactly the same, and these two are exactly the same. This again is just like a SAMI methodology. I consider it different because I'll be adding indicators to the raw file. So it's really just a reminder for me that, oh, I can't just use the file as is. I need to go ahead and I need to make some changes to it. So actually creating analytic files, again, this is sort of the coding and preparation for it. So the roadmap is now flipped because now we're starting with the raw data file. So that's why it looks a little different. It's flipped. So let's go ahead and let's start with, I'm going to go ahead and do flag creation in the claims files. So here's an example. So this is like an ED flag example. So at this point, what I'm doing is anything that needs an indicator, I'm creating an indicator for it. On the left-hand side, we have a fake revenue center file, and I put a little star next to the revenue center codes that indicate ER services. And then in the table to the right, you'll see I have another column, excuse me, and that column has a 1 anytime that there's a revenue center that has an ER revenue center code in it. So imagine I did this for all of the ER revenue center codes and for the negative outcomes. So now that we've added flags, we're going to want to roll up our revenue center files. So in this scenario, we do have a little bit of a dilemma. We need 1 row per event or per claim. But when you work with the revenue center or line files, you'll notice that there are multiple lines per single claim, and this is where you need to roll it up. What that really means is that you're creating 1 line out of multiple lines. You'll be overriding and summarizing data points, breaking that down even further, just keeping what you want and getting rid of what you don't want. This part, you have to be especially careful about how you code things because you may accidentally duplicate, overwrite, or delete rows. So normally when I do this in the CMS claims data, I do very small observation counts. Like maybe I'll do like obs equal 10 or obs equals 100 just to make sure that everything rolls up how I intend it to. So let's go over what it looks like visually. This is, again, depending on how you code, you might move about it differently. It's sort of just the general idea of how you want to get to where you're going to go. So let's go ahead and get started. So what you're seeing here on the left is a reduced variable revenue, inpatient revenue center file. So the revenue center file normally has like many variables, but you guys won't be able to read anything if I put them all on there. So I just focused on a very shrunken view. So the first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to remove claims that don't contain any ER revenue center codes. So here you'll see anything that has that doesn't have a 1 associated with it, we're going to remove that. Notice that for some claims do have multiple lines. So claims 1, 2, and 3 only have a single line, but claim 4 has 2 lines. You know, claim 7 has 3, and we just want to make sure that as long as they have the same claim ID, there's at least 1 ER revenue center code. And this is what we end up with variables. We're keeping the max value because we are just making sure that we know it's not overwritten in such a way that a 0 overwrites a 1. We want the 1s to overwrite 0s. And so that's the table that we have. So notice here, we're not really concerned with how claim through date and the claim line number are overwritten. We're going to remove these later. And then we remove variables that aren't related to our analysis. And this is the final table that we end up with. So just reviewing what we started with and what we ended with. So on the left, we started with that huge table, and then on the right is our roll-up file. General reminder of the action steps we took. We removed claims with no ER revenue center codes. We combined the rows via claim ID, making sure that we kept the max value of our indicator variables. And then we removed the variables that weren't relevant, to our analysis. So we're just going to repeat that process for the outpatient revenue center file, and that's how we get the table to our right. So we completed all of the steps in the first column. And now what we're going to try and do is we're going to merge the claim and the roll-up files. So here we have the inpatient claim and the inpatient revenue roll-up files. Notice that with the inpatient claim file, all we did was add a column to the far right for our negative outcome criteria. We don't have to roll up our inpatient claim file in this instance because we are looking at events/claims. So we don't have to roll it up. But if you were working with something like beneficiaries or providers, you would need to roll up the claim file as well. So we're going to go ahead and merge the data sets based on matching claim ID and beneficiary ID. And then remove any claims that don't have a match. And then we end up with a table that looks like this. And then as an extra step, we're just going to add our final negative outcome criteria. So if both criteria 1 and criteria 2 were equal to 1, then our negative outcome would equal to 1. Again, this is like fictional, so you guys would sort of make your own decisions on what your outcomes would look like. And then, like before, we just remove variables that aren't relevant to our analysis. And then this is our ER events file. Oh, and remember, we are keeping the provider number because that's what we need to link to our external data set. So then we repeat the process again for outpatient, and that's how we get the table on our right. So now we've gone ahead and we've created, we finished the second row, and we've created the OP ER events file and the IP ER events file. So now we're just going to concatenate or stack those two files on top of each other to create the all ER events file. So in this scenario, we're very confident that inpatient and outpatient ER events should be separate and not overlap or duplicate. So we can just concatenate, or stack our data sets on top of each other. And that's how we end up with our all ER events file. I'm just going to go and take an extra step here to create event IDs. Since you notice that the claim IDs overlap, we're just going to create new event IDs. It's really unlikely if you're working in RIF that claim IDs will overlap. You still can make event IDs if you're not sure, like you're working with multiple years of data. Just be aware that you may not be able to link back unless you create some type of event ID to claim ID crosswalk so that you can link back, so that you can merge the crosswalk to your final events file, so that you can merge it back to any claims files that you're interested in. All right, so we went ahead, stacked it, good to go. And now we can do the final step of merging our all ER events file, our MBSF base file, and our external file. So here I'm just showing you how we link it. To link to the MBSF base, we're going to use the beneficiary ID. And then to link to the external file, we're going to use the provider number. And then you get this table here. So last thing I like to do is compare the final table and the plan table. Sometimes my final table doesn't look like my plan table or is missing something important. So I always go back and double check. And as you can see here, some things are sort of like turned around, you know, like the provider number is in front of the negative outcome, but we have all the information that we need. And this would be considered our analytic file. So another polling question, sort of 2-in-1, if you've worked with CMS claims data or other healthcare claims data in the past, has it been your experience that an analytic file comes together this easily? Yes or no? And what have been your most common issues? And we have some listed here: missing information, duplicates, 2 pieces of data with conflicting information. If you answer yes to the first question, I would love to pick your brain. Someone did say yes, I will have to pick your brain later. I would love to know your wisdom. Oh, 2 of you. Are you guys just doing this now to flex on me? Totally okay, totally okay. So most of you said that, you know, it hasn't been this easy. Totally understandable. The claims files are just so massive. There are always little things that you don't notice on the way, or you know, maybe you assume that things will go a certain way and then they absolutely don't. Absolutely normal. And then what have been your most common issues? Most of you said more than one or all of the above. So missing information, duplicates, 2 pieces of information with conflicting information, or you just find things that you cannot explain. So all totally normal. Absolutely. So let's go ahead and sort of talk about troubleshooting. How to troubleshoot your analytic file. So some things we'll go over today. How will I know if my analytic file is correct? And when it's not correct, some things to consider. So data, policy, and some other solutions. And then some things to consider in terms of programming. So ways to identify potential mistakes when you're programming and how to fix those mistakes. So how will I know if my analytic file is correct? Most of the time, your product will tell you that you're wrong. That's been my experience. So you'll find that your final product is incorrect or it's not working as intended. You know, you'll see if you work in SaaS, all you'll read are red text saying that there's errors all over the place, or you'll do a visual review of your analytic file. Let's say you make an indicator and the indicator is always blank and you don't anticipate it to look like that. Or maybe you'll notice you do some general frequencies just to see how your code is doing, and you notice that there are issues with your frequencies. For example, let's say you're working with the MBSF and you run an age frequency and everyone is 12. That wouldn't make a lot of sense unless that was your cohort, I guess, if you wanted everyone that was exactly 12. So using your experience and knowledge as analysts, sort of being like, that doesn't quite make sense. You can also compare your findings to other CMS sources or literature reviews. And in general, you can always trust your gut instinct. This is something that if you haven't worked with the data, you may not have a gut instinct yet. But when you work more and more with the data, you'll kind of find that there are these little flags that go off and you're like, oh, that's weird. Whenever you feel that feeling, just take a quick look just to make sure that it's not anything major. So general considerations. You found an error with your analytic file or your final product. Things that we'll think about are, is it related to data? So how might the data be impacting my analytic file? So things we'll think about, for example, variable codes and definitions, reduction criteria. And what that means here is as you reduce your file, did anything that you reduce accidentally create some type of bias or shift the data in a certain direction? Or is there additional information that you didn't anticipate influencing the file? So maybe you're seeing a greater number of procedures and you forgot to remove chart reviews if you're working with the MA data, or there are, for example, there are also dummy records in the TAF-DE. Did you not remove those, and that's sort of causing some issues? Or is it related to policies? So if there are any like outbreaks or public health emergencies, that can influence the way that people act, that hospitals code, and that things that like CMS covers. So for example, if we think more recently, COVID, if any of you had tried working with CMS claims files during the COVID pandemic, you'll notice you would have had the experience of seeing new HCPCS codes pop up every couple of months and being like, oh, I forgot, I have to recode or I have to add things to my crosswalk, or I have to rerun my analytic file because things are different now. So again, sort of highlighting that, how might CMS policy impact my analytic file, and ways that we can look into that. So things like the claims processing manual, or looking if there are any existing or changing reimbursement or coding rules. So let's dig deeper into things about data. So am I choosing the right variables or values for my study? So a couple examples I have here are, how many diagnosis codes or procedure codes did you use in your algorithm? Depending on which file you're looking at, you may find a difference if you only use the first diagnosis code, or if you use all of the diagnosis codes available to you. And for those of you who aren't aware, there's a state code in the MBSF file. And there are some states that have multiple values. So I know for sure Texas has 2 values technically in the state code variable. We've had questions on that before. One of them is used frequently and one of them is not. So if you accidentally choose the one that's never or very rarely used, you might notice like, oh, there's nobody in Texas right now. So have there been any major coding changes? We talked about ICD-9 to ICD changes. And then also new or discontinued ICD or HCPCS codes. I have the blue text here. If you download it, hopefully it'll take you to a link of currently coverable codes from CMS. So it'll take you to the CMS website and it'll be like, these are codes that we accept right now. And then is there any additional information in the data dictionary that sort of indicates or gives me ideas of what's going on? So the comment section can be really juicy for things that you may have assumed were not happening, but in the comment section it's addressed. You can also look and see what the data source is in the data dictionary. And if the data source is something like the NCH, so as you can see here, you can actually go to the NCH's data dictionary that's linked here. and see if there's any additional information that you weren't able to capture in the data dictionaries, either on the ResDAC website, so our website, or in CCW's data dictionaries. And then a few more things. So is what you're seeing, so does this happen on the raw file versus the analytic file? Sometimes, you know, let's go back to the frequency equals 12, right? You go back to the raw file and the frequency shows that it's not 12. So that sort of indicates that something happened during coding or during the creation of your analytic file that overwrote things, and that sort of gives you an idea of where to look. Do any data points need to be removed or addressed? So we talked about these a little bit, duplicate data points. So maybe you might see a few instances where you have the same beneficiary on the same day. And then also thinking about, do you have denied claims in your data, or have you, if you haven't removed them, same with chart reviews. And how consistently do I find my issue? So consistency in this instance can mean both time and overall. So when and where your issue arises can indicate where to look for more information. So two ways to think about it. If it happens like 0.001% of the time, one thing you might want to think about is 10,000 sounds like a lot, but in the scope of Medicare, because of the sheer number of Medicare claims, does that impact your end goals? And depending on your timelines and things, do you have the time to sort of dig into those 10,000 claims if you need to? And then another way to sort of think about how consistently is over time. So you can do yearly frequencies, monthly frequencies, and sort of pinpoint like, oh, this is where that issue sort of arises. So let's actually look at a data example. What we're doing here is we were reviewing the average NPI completeness in the carrier claim file from 2012, excuse me, to 2017. One thing you might notice though is that billing provider is only 83% complete. This causes a red flag for us because if it's only 83% complete, how does Medicare know who to reimburse? We would expect the billing provider to be filled nearly 100%. So we go back, we dig it out. So this is like that consistency piece that I talked about before. And we noticed that there's a sudden drop off in 2012 as we move backwards. So what's the issue here? And this was something that I had looked into actually, and it was extensive review of data dictionaries, past announcements, et cetera, et cetera. And ultimately what it boiled down to is that this particular variable was introduced in 2017. So the data layout changed in 2017, which is when 2016 annual data are typically released. And so from the data files from 2005 to 2015, excuse me, were updated to match the new layout. In these circumstances, we sort of figure that sometimes there are limited backfill. So that's what we're sort of assuming is the case going on here. So with that in mind, we'll have to find an alternative, but which alternative will depend on what your study needs. Now let's think about policies, right? What policies might impact my analytic file? Some are kind of general. So some situations are just very uniquely coded. So if you're looking at professional versus technical components, that's something that's just very, that's just something that's laid out in the claims processing manual. Another thing you want to think about is, has CMS policy changed over time? Or did they introduce new policies that impact your study topic? Or were there any major events that impacted your analytic file? So our policy example for today, we're looking at home health agency claims from 2018 to 2020. And we notice here that there is a sudden uptick in claim counts in 2020. So first thing, we're going to do that consistency piece again and see like maybe it's a monthly thing. So we broke it down by month and year to see if we can find any additional information. And the yellow line is the total home health claims per month and year. And we see that the jump starts in February 2020. So you might be like, Sammy, okay, so I have to check policy, but where do I check the policy? Here's some sources that you can look at. So one thing you can do, sorry, it's really small on my screen, so I'm gonna like look at my main screen, don't mind me. So some things you can look at are CMS will have announcements on their page. So here you can see the first bullet point. I have a little set of directions to sort of help you find if you want to find announcements on a specific Medicare fee-for-service payment page. CMS also has these Medicare Learning Network articles and publications. These are really useful because they really, they're not that technical. They're very layman's terms, so it's easy to sort of pick up and read. And then if you want to get really into the weeds, you can go to the claims processing manual. And there is where you'll typically find, like, in ABC situation, you should do 1, 2, 3 and things like that. Other ways to find CMS sources, use a search engine of choice. I found that you can just honestly type in your exact problem, and sometimes you find exactly what you're looking for. Or you train your search engine over time to give you what you're looking for. So in this situation, I would probably just type in something like 2020 Home Health Agency CMS policy change, and pray that something useful would come up. If you're looking for historical announcements, you can try using the Wayback Machine. So this is a website, not affiliated with CMS. They're their own thing. But it allows you to view older instances of CMS web pages. So this is really useful if you think that there was an announcement on a CMS page that is no longer present. It can also sometimes give you old files too, but I can't promise you it will do that for everything that you need. So we went and we looked up some potential policy changes, and we found that there was a change in 2020. So prior to 2020, home health agency claims could cover 60 days of care. And now, starting in 2020, they only cover 30 days of care. So, so that's why we're sort of seeing the uptick, is because it went from 60 to 30. So if there were claims that needed to be 60 days in length, they would double, right? So there would be more. You might also sort of be thinking like, hey, Sammy, I thought you said the jump started in February. So what about January? In that case, we're going to assume in this case that there was a transition period. Sometimes CMS announces that they're going to do a transition period from, A to B. For this particular instance, there really wasn't a mention of a set time transition period. So for 2020, we're just going to assume that the delayed claim count jump is due to a transition. Other considerations or resources, definitely reach out to colleagues who have expertise in your subject and experience with CMS data. Especially if you find strange hiccups, sometimes you can go to someone more knowledgeable than you are and then say, hey, I noticed this. And they'll say, oh, yeah, that's normal. Do this and this and this instead. Steph, Nate, and Beth have probably heard that from me a ton. So definitely reach out to people with lots of expertise. Definitely try sensitivity analyses. So if you aren't sure if what you're seeing, if you're really stuck on something and you can't figure out what it is, a sensitivity analysis can sort of help you put things back in perspective. Is this blip that I'm seeing, does it impact my outcomes or not? And again, when you make a decision, just document everything you thought behind it and then stick with it. And of course, you can contact ResDAC as well. You can always ask us. We are very versed in digging in the claims processing manuals, especially our TAs. So we're very happy to help. So let's go ahead and look at an example with no real answer. So this is the prior table, not our analytic file, but a file before we turned it into the analytic file. And our issue here is that we've got 2 claims for 2 beneficiaries. And, oops, sorry. Let me see here. 10. And you'll see that the claim from dates for beneficiary A and G, they are overlapping. So what do we do in this scenario? So what can you do? Looking at it like, very, very simply, you can keep both, you can delete both, or you can keep one. And if you decide to keep one, do you do it based on criteria, which I think is more standard because that has more control in terms of like making sure that you really get the information that you're looking for, or random, which is easier than criteria, but but is a different way of looking at things. And if you're not sure what to choose, definitely try all of them and focus on what's lost based on your criteria, because in my experience, it's easier to look at what you've lost and say, oh, I need that, rather than to see what I keep and be like, oh, I don't need that. But again, that's my brain thinking. So do what your brain does best. So let's look at programming considerations. Oh, actually, I think there is one chat. Maybe the claims from December 2019 could still be covering 60 days into January 2020. Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Yolanda, for providing that example. Yeah, there are lots of different reasonings that you can put to sort of explain the delay that we saw previously. Back into programming considerations. These are all SAS-centric, but you can apply the same logic to your other coding programs. So ways to identify potential mistakes. Definitely review logs before moving to the next step. I like to compare row counts as I go step to step, or as you reduce your files, and then also check for error messages. And then I mentioned the second one, run a small subsample first to make a visual confirmation. So anywhere, I put 10 to 100. You could really put up to 10,000 here. If you create like an indicator to help you figure out whether or not your code is doing what you want. You definitely don't want to run it, like let's say you're working with the TAF-DE, which can be a very massive file. You don't want to run your whole code and then wait half a day, and then you find out at the end of the day that there was a small error, so you have no data files at the end of the day. So that's why I always say just try it small first if it's something that's a little bit new or different. And then you can also run monthly or annual frequencies. So like in the examples that I showed, to sort of get a better idea of like, where am I seeing this mistake happen? So fixing mistakes, use your log. So that's log in this case, for those of you who might not be experienced with SAS. The log will show your code and then any notes that your coding system has about what you've written. So it might have like, warning, this didn't run because A, B, C, D, and things like that. So use your log to identify potential coding issues. Double check your variable names, formats, and definitions. A personal example is when I first started working with CMS data, I had assumed that provider variables would always be numeric, because most of the time, if you sort of scroll through what you're seeing in the raw data files, they all look numeric. And I actually ended up, most of my errors when I first started were things where I assumed it would be numeric or character, and it was actually the other way around. And then, worst comes to worst, just restart your coding program. So restart SAS. Sometimes it's just stopped for too long and it needs a break. So let's go ahead and sort of review what I've talked about. Overall, I think you guys can take away that, excuse me, it depends. It really depends on what you need for your study and what you're looking at. So all of these things that we talked about today, sort of take those ideas and then apply it to what you're thinking about for your project, but don't sort of let it be, don't let what I say dictate what your project should be, because you guys know what you guys know your projects best. And then just a couple things quickly. So when you're sending troubleshooting questions to ResDAC, here's some tips that help us help you. So some useful information to include, what is your overall goal or problem? Do you have a cohort? Because that'll definitely impact how we sort of look at things. Are you using the VRDC or do you have physical data? What years of data files being used? And then you'll see very close to the bottom is what's your actual issue, because it helps us to have sort of the story first. And then how frequently can you identify this issue? And then overall, please don't send us individual data tables or points or screenshots of your data. This is in violation of CMS's self-suppression policy. If you want to send, like sort of general ideas, I think that helps us a lot. And if we need something more specific, we will tell you, but we won't ask you for your data. 100% we will not ask you for your data. All right, so thank you for sort of sticking it out with me. Do you guys have any questions? So there is a question, what is the best way to get all information, especially cost per procedure, from carrier file for inpatient or outpatient for each patient? Because the Benny ID is the only common variable in all three, but Benny's can have multiple entries. So I don't know if there is a best approach to this. It'll really depend on what you're looking for, especially for cost. But for your particular question, it might help to look at the MBSF cost and use file to see how they summarize the data and see if that's something, if that's how you would like to code your data. I think, yeah, so I think that's a good start, is to look at the MBSF cost and use, because that's in that file, they summarize by file and by some certain procedures. Sometimes they do by certain procedures, like surgical procedures. I believe they have a row for that. Are there any other questions? If not, thank you so much. It was a joy sort of showing this to you guys. If you guys have any questions, feel free to contact us at ResDAC.